All right, folks, good morning. We are back. Um, Again, we went ahead and started on SSLVPN this week. We are going to hit the midpoint of our studies. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Today is going to be a little hybrid lab. We're going to go back and forth because today we're going to go over how to configure SSLVPNs. Okay. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So, right, you guys should be able to, after all of this, being able to configure, SSL VPN settings on Fortigate, also be able to go ahead and define SSL VPN users, and go ahead and create firewall policies specifically for SSL VPN interface that's on the Fortigate. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right. So a couple of things. There's a checklist that you want to do, sort of an order of operations, right? You kind of, right, can go ahead and do it out of order. I don't recommend it because you may miss a step. So how the study guide explains it, I would go ahead and take that step by step, right? And those steps, are, one, go ahead and create your users and accounts, right? Configure the SSL VPN portal, right? And we'll go over on how to do that. Configure the SSL VPN settings, right? Because those are two totally different things. Create a firewall policy to accept and decrypt packets, right? And that policy is also used to go ahead and allow inside access to the network, right? To internal networks. And also 5, optionally, you can go ahead and create a firewall policy to allow traffic from the SSL VPN client to the internet and apply security profiles. Now, what does that apply to? That only applies to if you are not doing split tunneling. Okay, that would mean the traffic flow, right, from the source, being our SSL VPN user, to the destination, being the internet, it would source from the SSL VPN user, go over the internet, hit, right, the firewall, right, then go back out through the firewall to go ahead and go to the internet. Okay, that would be the traffic flow for the SSL VPN client if split tunneling is disabled. Okay. All right. So step 1, right? Set up user accounts and groups, right? First things first, we're going to go ahead and define the user accounts and groups, right? And then second, of course, configure the SSL VPN authentication methods, right? We can either do local password authentication, we can do remote password authentication that you guys learned about before, right? In section 5 of the study guide, so LDAP, Radius, TechX, right? Or we can use MFA, right? 2MFA, right? Two-factor authentication, right? You get a token code, and of course, username and password, right? So let's go ahead and do that right now. Let's hop in. If I can put the password in correctly. All right. So, right, we got our FortiGate here set up. Let's go ahead and define our users, right? So let's go ahead and go to user authentication. We're going to go ahead and go to user definition, right? We're going to go ahead and say local user, right? We'll keep it local. We'll say test 1. We are not going to enable 2FA, so we're going to go ahead and click next, right? And we're going to go ahead and click enable. We'll add it to a user group later, right? So we got test 1. That's set up, good to go, right? We're going to go ahead and define our user groups. We're going to call this simple VPN, all right? Users, all right? Keep it simple, and we'll go ahead and add a user, right? Keep it simple, okay? So we got that set up, okay? We're not doing external, right? We're not doing remote authentication. The same thing you guys learned in section 5. So we won't configure that servers, Radius servers, or, right, since we're not doing 2FA, and we don't have any 40 tokens, we won't configure that, but you are able to do so, Okay, you're able to provision those and hand those out to your users if you have those configured and purchased from Fortinet. Okay, so we won't do that today. So we have that set in stone. We're good to go. So let's go ahead and see what's next on the list to go ahead and tackle. All right. Next, we need to go ahead and configure the SSLVPN portal. Right. And so, what is the portal? Right. What the portal contains, whenever you set that up, right, it's telling us what tools and resources, links we're giving the users access to, right? So we talked about tunnel mode and web mode, right? And so this is what we're enabling whenever we get to the portal, depending on the type of portal access we're going to give our users, right? And so we can configure, right? Sometimes with the FortiGates out of the box, they'll have pre-configured 3 options. They have full access, tunnel access, web access, right? And as you can see, right, you'll see it'll go ahead, full access. You have access to both pre-configured tunnel mode and web mode. Tunnel access, you only have access to tunnel mode, but web mode will be disabled, right? Web access, tunnel mode will be disabled and only web mode will be available. Okay, so of course, you see the create new option. So you guys create your own custom portal, right? So you're able to do that as well. Of course, whenever you go ahead and get into configuring your SSLVPN portal, you being that administrator, you are able to choose if you want to go ahead and enable split tunneling, right? You can also go ahead and configure your routing address, right? Or your routing address. And it's so complicated in this sense to where I was rolling around for hours, right? So I'll make it as simple as possible. Your routing address is you are setting for users, and you're saying what networks you have access to behind the FortiGate, right? And the reason why that's complicated, right, is because when you get into the portal, right, you'll see an option that says, right, enable split tunneling, right, based on destinations, right? And you'll see that you'll interpret that as, okay, well, I created a firewall policy, right? And like Hevia and Antoine, they went ahead and created the firewall policy to allow traffic from SSLVPN users to these specific networks behind the firewall. You would assume when you enable split tunneling and you choose the option of enabled based on policy destinations, it would enable access to those networks. That is incorrect. Okay, you would actually have to go ahead and configure what access your SSLVPN end users, right, what networks they would have access to in the portal, okay, by setting the routing address, okay, right, and then we'll go ahead and go over that and how to do that, right. We also would go ahead and set what IP pool, right, has access to what networks, right. So if you have, of course, we're going to have to configure a pool of addresses for SSLVPN users to go ahead and connect. We are going to go ahead and also, right, and it's recommended, you don't have to do it, but it's recommended to go ahead and configure a range, pool, or what have you, of addresses for SSLVPN users and set it as the source IP pool in your portal, right? Because this is what your end users are going to get whenever they connect, right? And they have a successful connection. Okay. Also, within the SSLVPN portal, we can go ahead and enable web mode, right? Or change the web mode settings, right? We can go ahead and define theme, a couple of settings. We can go ahead and set the bookmarks, set individual links, so what have you, so on and so forth. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and do that. All right. So let's go to VPN. let's go to SSLVPN portal, right? So we have here full access, right? We're going to go ahead and create a custom one, right? And we'll say, okay, so let's slow down and take a look at this, right? We have a couple of options. First things first, right after we set the name, right? Limit users to one SSL VPN connection at a time. You are able to set that, right? Totally up to you. I personally recommend doing that, but again, to each its own. You guys are the network security engineers, so you would have to make that decision on your own, right? By default, right? Whenever you create a new one, web mode and tunnel mode are enabled, right? Let's look at the split tunneling options, right? So with tunnel mode, that's the first option we get by default. We have here enable based on policy destination. And here's what I mean as far as it can be kind of confusing, right? Where it says only client traffic in which the destination matches the destination of the configured firewall policies will be directed over the SSL VPN tunnel, right? And so the verbiage, right, would assume that if you configure a firewall policy that's saying, hey, you have access to these networks, they should automatically be able to access networks that are configured in your firewall policy. That is correct. But, right, I love Fortinet, but you also need to go ahead and set the routing address, right, override to say what networks they would have access to. Okay, so we're going to leave this setting here, right? And because of course we want to enable split tunneling, and we're going to go ahead and create our routing address override, right? And so we're going to go ahead and create a address, right? Subnet, right? Call it later. You know what? Let's, no, we don't have that in place. So let's go ahead and create the address object. Right, land for this lab. Set it to that. Perfect. Actually, specific. Perfect. All right. So we're giving them access to the right, and that's real, right? But we need to go ahead and define the source pools, right? Now, what I'm about to tell you guys is outside of the exam parameters, but for a lot of you guys, a lot of Fortinet administrators, right? If you guys deploy a lot of FortiGates, you guys typically are managing a lot of those FortiGates through FortiManager. Quick tip, do not use the SSL VPN tunnel address one default address object. And here's the reason why. If you have FortiGates, right, and we ran into this issue, if you have FortiGates that are managed in the same administrative domain, what can happen is as you continue to import those FortiGates into FortiManager, right, and you import those policies and objects, every time you import a new FortiGate, this would get overwritten. Dangerous, right? Especially when if you push down policies and objects from FortiManager. So we've learned the hard way to go ahead and create your own address objects, right? Specific to your firewall, right? So I'm going to go ahead and call this, right? And that was a little tangent, but I think it will help you guys for those that actually still that work on FortiManager and work on FortiGates, okay? So I'm going to be very specific. Okay. So, we'll do it that way. Excellent. All right. So we got that in place, right? So our users connect, right? Label based on policy destination. We're giving them access to our local area network, right? And the IP address pool that is able to go ahead and reach local area network whenever they connect to the SSLVPN are SSLVPN users that we get an IP address of 172.16.10.100 through 200, right? So we got that set, right? We can go ahead and set also for those that are using tunnel mode, right? Those that are using FortiClient app to go ahead and we can set some options. We can say, hey, allow clients to go ahead and save the password, allow clients to connect automatically, allow clients to keep connections alive, and DNS split tunneling, right? How does that help? Well, same has for split tunneling as far as traffic flow for your local internet traffic and traffic that's destined for resources behind the FortiGate, right? You can actually enable DNS split tunneling, right? To enable you can have DNS servers both, right? That's set for your SSL VPN adapter, right? That's configured once you install FortiClient, right? And also your local DNS server. What will happen is that, hey, for DNS queries that are destined for resources behind your FortiGate, it'll go that way. But DNS queries that's destined for the internet, it'll go strictly to the internet. Okay, so you can configure, you can go ahead and enable that option as well. Okay, let's take a look at host check, right? What is that? What is the host check? Well, in the host check, we can go ahead and say, excuse me, we can go ahead and say, hey, do they have specific things, right? Do they have antivirus? Right? Do they have a local firewall, right? Or do they have both, right? They need to pass these checks before, even if they have the correct username and password, we can tell, right, the FortiGate to say, hey, before you connect, we're going to do a check and say, do you pass these parameters, right? If you don't pass these parameters, even though your username and password is correct, we still won't give you access, okay? So you can enable that feature, okay? Also, you have the option to go ahead and restrict, right, connections if they to specific OS versions. So if you want to say, hey, do you have Windows 10? Do you have Mac OS in a certain version, right? You can limit it to a certain version, right? So if somebody has Windows 8, you can go ahead and say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and deny connections, even though you have FortiClient installed, deny connections from Windows 8, 8.1, right? So on and so forth. So you have that option to do so. Okay. Tunnel mode is very powerful, and that's why I typically go ahead and recommend it. FortiNet recommends it versus web mode. But web mode has its uses. Okay. Of course, down here, right, we have the option to enable, right, and disable web mode, right? We can go ahead and put a few things. So session information, show connection launcher, show a few things, right? We can go ahead and set that here. We saw during our lesson this week that you guys are able to go ahead and, as the administrators, right, engineers, you're able to set, some bookmarks. We can go ahead and do that here, right? For this lab, we'll go ahead and call it SSH, or we'll call it, we'll, we'll, we'll call it switch one, right? Because we're going to go ahead and test to see if we can access the switch, right? All right. There we go. We'll set that, right? We'll set that up, make sure that's good. Okay. Oh, that's correct, right? So, with the BMW, go ahead and add an extra one. So I'll go ahead and just manipulate that. Okay. Um, that, that up. That. We got that set up. All right. So now that we have that configured, let's go ahead and go back and see what's next on the list. All right. And we'll take a look at how this looks once we're done as far as the port. So we won't go through that yet, but this is specifically how it looks, right? When we type in the address, type in the port number, we should be able to see all our bookmarks, right? We have available a quick connection, what have you, some history, what have you have all these things, all these widgets pop up that you have access to in WebNet. Okay. All right. And these are just a few things we've talked about over the past week. So I'm not going to go into detail. You guys can actually look at your study guide and take a look at the specific protocols that we're enabling in web mode. Okay, because that's the difference, right? Web mode, we're enabling specific protocols. And of course, tunnel mode, based on your firewall policies, you're enabling all protocols. Okay, and specific protocols as well. Right? So what's next? Before any of our users can go ahead and connect to the SSLVPN, we need to go ahead and enable the Fortigate to be SSLVPN server, right? And configure the SSLVPN settings, right? And so we need to of course, define the port, right? Restrict access to known hosts, right? We go ahead and say, hey, the idle logout timer, right? We need to go ahead and identify if we're going to use a SSL VPN server certificate, right? And that's a very important part, right? In regards to connections over a untrusted, right? Public domain, right? Which is, of course, the internet, right? If you're going to have your users connect to a firewall, it is highly recommended to make sure you have either you have a public certificate from a public trusted certificate authority, GoDaddy, Cloudflare, what have you, that you went ahead and purchased and you got configured right on the internet from a trusted source. You install that cert right on the firewall, right? You can use less encrypt or what have you, right? And once you do that, your end user will go ahead and have a trusted certificate, right? That'll be good to go. If you don't have access to that, right, you can go ahead and go the old school way, right? Use a self-signed certificate, but you would have to install that same certificate on your end user's PC, right? So we would configure that in the SSL VPN settings as well. Okay. Like I said, you define your IP range. We already created that address object, so there's gonna be no problem there. We would also define what our DNS server is going to be for our SSL VPN. Okay. All right. So we go ahead and set that up. And what is this for? Like, this is for whenever they're trying to reach internal resources, right? They're able to reach those internal resources by not just IP, but fully qualified domain name. Okay. And of course, last but not least, us configuring those portals here where that would come in, we would go ahead and of course, match the users or groups, right, to a specific port. Okay. So let's go ahead and get that. We go to SSLVPN settings. We're going to go ahead and start here, right? It's going to tell me, right, SSLVPN settings are not fully configured, right? Because I'm not listening on the interface, right? So I'm going to go ahead and set that here, right? Listen, I'm going to go ahead and listen on port 443, keeping that standard. But what I told you guys this week, right, is we have to make sure of this, right? Port conflicts with administrative HTTPS port for this system, right? So we're going to go ahead and keep the same. We'll go and change the system's administrative HTTPS port, right? Because it's real simple for the end users just to connect to this, right? Because we're going to do 443 regardless. Okay, you want to make it as seamless as possible, right? We can go ahead and set up the redirect, but we're not going to do that. We're good to go. So we don't have a certificate, so we may have to just use HTTP. But you can go ahead and configure that and actually set that up. I actually have that toggled for the company that I work for, so it's good to go. You can, like we saw in the PowerPoint, you are able to restrict access. You can say allow access from any host or limit access to specific hosts. And of course, you can define that within an address object, okay? For this lab, we'll go ahead and say allow access from any host, right? Idle logout, right? So if there's no traffic, if there's no traffic traversing the tunnel, their end user is not doing anything, their PC is completely, locked, shut down, no traffic, you can go ahead and set it to go ahead and just log out the user automatically, right? Because what we don't want to do, right, is have a vector that's open for bad actors to go ahead and intercept traffic, right, and do some bad things on our net. Okay. All right. So service certificate, right? Just like I told you guys, you can go ahead and use a built-in, right, certificate. You can self-sign. You're more than happy to do so, right? But again, you would have issues and you would get a warning that says, hey, it's not a signed certificate, it's not safe, etc. Right? So again, shout out to the guys at FORTINET that build FortiOS. You do have the option to use less encrypt, right? Public service, right? You can go ahead and configure that, right? Reaches out to the internet, create your, certificate on the actual box. And it'll be a public trusted certificate, right? As long as you got a certificate out in the world as well, you configure it, boom, right? You can also configure a local certificate. Maybe you have a CA configured locally, maybe on your Windows server or your Linux server within your environment. You can import that into the FortiGate, then disperse that to all your end users as well. You can do that as well. So as long as, again, it's that certificate matches on both sides. Okay. So just make sure you have the correct public key infrastructure within your environment if you're going to go ahead and use a trust certificate. Okay. Of course, we can go ahead and require a client certificate to set that up, right? Well, but we can go ahead and, of course, I implore you guys as well for you network security engineers, if you're not privy on, anything server related, reach out to your server guys, collab with them to go ahead and get this certificate signed set up. Okay. Now we move on to go ahead and tunnel it, right? Here's where we go ahead and set the set the address range to where what the end user, whenever they connect to SSLVPN, what IP address is going to be given. As you can see here, right, if I leave it to automatically assign addresses, it is going to use the SSLVPN DHCP default address objects that I showed you guys, right? Okay. What do I mean by that? It's right here. Like I said, you can use it. You have the option to, you can change the IP address range for what it'll work for you. I do not recommend this. Again, for the sake of if you will be managing FortiGates from FortiManager, right? We're going to go ahead and use what we can do, right? So we got that set up, right? We can also go ahead and define our DNS server, right? keep it simple, give it Google, right? But again, if they're going to access internal resources, right? You want to go ahead and set that DNS server to internal DNS server, right? Secondary, what have you, right? Of course, again, engage with your server guys to make sure you put in the correct DNS server. I'm going to just do 8 by 8 by 8 by 8 for now, right? We can also configure Win servers, right? If you guys have that infrastructure, you also have the option to set that up. Last but not least, authentication and portal map, right? We can go ahead and map groups to a specific portal that we set up within that SSLVPN ports, right? We're basically saying what options they will get and what settings they will get, what networks they will have access to, if they have access to tunnel mode or web mode, based on what we define per that portal, okay? Right, we only have one portal defined, so we're going to say full access, all right? So we have that set up. Everything's good to go, right? But we're getting a error, right? No VPN, SSLVPN policies exist. Click here to create a new SSLVPN policy using these settings, right? So let's take a side step, and let's go ahead and talk about it, right? So at step 4, right? It's one of the last mandatory steps, because the next one is optional, is to create firewall policies for our users to log on, right? And so whenever, right, you enable SSLVPN, right, there's going to be an interface created on your FortiGate called SSL dot whatever the virtual domain is, or VDOM, right? Each VDOM, right, will have, right, sidestep here. Each VDOM will have its own SSL virtual interface based on its name, okay? We are in the root. We didn't create any additional VDOMs, so we are in the root VDOM by default. So whenever we go back into FortiGate, it's going to say SSL dot root. That's going to be the that's root is the VDOM that we're in. Okay. So we'll go ahead and be able to see that that's the interface that we're looking for, right? And last but not least, to activate and successfully log into SSLVPN. Again, to activate and successfully log into SSLVPN, there must be a firewall policy in place, right? From the SSLVPN interface to the interface to which you want to allow access to for the VPN users, okay? Whenever we do go ahead and create this firewall policy, we need to go ahead and define the IP address range, right? And we need to go ahead and define the users in the source. That is who we're giving access to via the SSL VPN policy, okay? And the reason why is that not just for tunnel mode, but also for web mode. If you don't configure this, that login portal that's happening in the background will not be activated and they will not be authenticated. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and do that. All right. So go here. Luckily, you can just click on that and let me just go back and make sure I actually save those settings. Okay, excellent. So I did save those settings. Let's go back here. We're going to call this, all right. All right. So, right, we have here, like I told you guys, right, we have the interface, SSL dot, the name of the VDOM, right? We're in the root VDOM, right? We didn't create any additional VDOMs, so we're just going to say root. So we got that set. Outgoing, we're going to go ahead and call it, right, LAN, right? Because we're giving it access to the interface. We're setting the outgoing interface to the interface to where the network we want to give it access to, right? So we want to give it access to the internal resources, all right? Source, again, source is going to be our SSLVPN users. So first we can go ahead and identify, right, what IP address range there'll be, right, that subnet that there'll be. But we need to go ahead and also define a user group. right? So this is why we had to create a group, right? Because either if we created a, right, we did remote authentication, we would, of course, use a group, right? Or if we create local users, you want to put those local users in a group because it'd be a headache putting each and every individual user defined on the FortiGate within a within this firewall policy. So we're going to go ahead and say SSLVPN. That's set, right? Destination, we're going to be as specific as possible. Our local area network, right? And our local area network being 172.16.1.0. Okay, right? Services, you can say, of course, what you want to give them access to. We're just going to say all. Okay, right? Right, we can go ahead and say if we want to do net, and that is definitely needs to be enabled, right? For the sake of what routing or what have you. Okay, over the internet, of course, how packet rewrite is happening. Okay. And of course, you can go ahead and enable your utility. You can enable antivirus, application control, IPS, web filter, you name it. As long as you have, and to take it, you know, do a blast of the past, as long as you have a Fortinet subscription, right, to FortiGuard, go ahead and get these signature updates. If not, you can enable these, but they are going to use pre-configured signatures that come out of the box from the factory from Fortigate. Okay. All right. Of course, you can also do SSL inspection, right? We have not talked about SSL inspection. I implored you guys to read that on your own, but this is another UTM, right? We're gonna go ahead and set that, all right? We're gonna go ahead and for the login options, right? You can do it by security events, all sessions, right? I like to do mine all sessions. I like to go ahead and generate logs when sessions start. Why, right? You guys just learned about logging and monitoring. It is a big help whenever you guys are troubleshooting. So you can actually troubleshoot SSLVPN users if you're having issues. So I like to go ahead and turn on logging for even this policy that's related to SSLVPN users as well. Okay. And last but not least, you can decide to enable or disable this policy. We're going to enable it and hit OK. Right. Last but not least, we have this little error that popped up for the administrative report. Let's go ahead and change that. Right. So we don't have issues. I'm going to change that to 8. Right. What should happen is my session should restart. Yeah, there we go. Well, acting wonky. Don't worry about it. That's not our focus for this lab. So we have that set up, right? Let's actually go back to the VPN settings. Our action, right? So that error went, right? And so now that we went ahead and set that, right? Just to show you guys again, that optional policy that we can create, right? So again, if we disabled split tunnel, right? You can also create a policy to where those the SSLVPN users have to go through the firewall to get to the internet, right? So we would create the source, your SSLVPN interface, and we could put it towards the WAN, right? And so my Kivia can go ahead and of course, same as before, right? Go ahead and identify what's the source going to be. Destination, we're going to say all, right? Say all here, all right? We're still, you know, natting or what have you, okay? She can, but here's the part where it comes in, right? You can go ahead and apply those security profiles that all these unified threat management profiles that we have enabled, right? You can go ahead and enable it here, right? And why would we do this, right? As administrators, if we want to go ahead and have total control, right, of what's passing through the firewalls, what our end users are doing, we can enable this policy, right? We can go ahead and configure this, right? As long as split tunneling is disabled, this is what the path that they would take. They would not go through their local internet. They would go through first the tunnel, the SSLVPN tunnel, then access the internet. And we spoke about, right, the pros and cons of that, right? If your split tunneling is disabled, right, on that FortiGate, we are going to have a bandwidth burden, right, to the point to where there may be some packets that might be dropped, okay? And there may be an increase in resources being used on the FortiGate, right? So just keep that in mind, right, whenever you're doing this in your engineering. But you do have the option to do so, okay? All right. Right, but we have split tunneling enabled, so I'm gonna go ahead and disable this policy. Okay. All right, so back to this session, right? Back to the PowerPoint, right? And I know Don's waiting for this, but we're gonna do this in the next session, because we're coming up on time, right? There are several steps on how to configure, right? The FortiGate has a client. And like I said, we're going to go over this in the next session. So this will be a twofold one for lab day. Okay. So don't harp on it. I'm going to ask you guys 2 questions, right? And we're going to go ahead and close out this session. Question 1, right? Which step is necessary to configure SSL VPN connections? Is it A, create a firewall policy from SSLVPN interface to the internal interface? Or is it B, enable event logs for SSLVPN traffic users, VPN and endpoints?
It's A.
There we go. Okay, question 2. Which action may allow internet access in tunnel mode if the remote network does not allow internet access to SSLVPN users? Is it A, enable split tunneling, or is it B, configure the DNS server to use the same DNS server as the client system DNS?
It's A, enable split tunneling.
There we go. Okay, you guys are getting good. All right, with that being said, we have come to the conclusion. Oh, Daniel, yeah, I went ahead and saw your answer. Excellent. You are correct as well. We've come to the conclusion of this session. So we had a bit of a hybrid day, lab, fun day, and of course, theory. Hopefully it all makes sense. Did you guys have any questions before we close out the session?
I have one.
Yes, sir.
So can FortiGate be used with LDAP service such as Active Directory or the Linux equivalent for authentication purposes?
Sir, we had a session in section 5 that goes over firewall authentication, and that's specific section was remote authentication.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions, guys?
No, none for me.
All right, guys. All right. Well, you guys have a great day. Tuan, I will go ahead and post another Zoom invite, and we'll go ahead and jump in about 10 minutes. Okay.
Gotcha.
Alrighty, thank you, David.
No problem.
Thanks, D.